Do you even understand English, or are you just pretending to work? The words didn't come out loud at first. They slipped between a quiet laugh and the clink of crystal glasses, soft enough to sound like a joke, sharp enough to cut through the room anyway. Conversations didn't stop, but they slowed. Heads tilted. Eyes shifted. Because tone, not volume, carries power in places like this. The restaurant glowed under warm amber lights, polished wood reflecting the soft shimmer of Manhattan's skyline beyond the windows, each table dressed in white linen, each guest dressed like they belonged to something larger than themselves. At the center of it all sat Ethan Caldwell, perfectly composed, his tailored navy suit untouched by a wrinkle, a Swiss watch catching the light every time he moved his hand. People didn't just listen when he spoke, they adjusted. Investors leaned in. Assistants stayed alert. Even the air seemed to pause, waiting for his next word. And standing just to his right, holding a notepad steady in one hand, was Clara Whitmore. She didn't look like she belonged in that orbit. Simple black uniform. Hair pulled back. No jewelry except a thin silver band on her wrist. But there was something else, something quieter. The kind of stillness that doesn't come from nervousness, but from control. Her hand trembled for just a second as she wrote down his order correction, then steadied. Her eyes didn't drop. Not fully. Just enough to remain professional. Ethan didn't look at her when he spoke again. He never really did. I asked for medium rare. This is closer to well done than anything acceptable. His voice stayed calm. Almost bored. The kind of calm that made people apologize before they even understood what went wrong. Clara glanced at the plate once. Not long. Just enough. I'll have the kitchen remake that for you right away, sir. Her voice was even. Soft. No edge. No defense. He exhaled, leaning back slightly, finally turning his head toward her like she had just entered his field of vision for the first time. That's not the point. A pause. Measured. The point is attention to detail. Something that seems difficult to find tonight. A few quiet chuckles surfaced from the table. Not loud. Never loud. Just enough to signal alignment. Agreement. Safety. Clara nodded once.
No argument. No apology repeated.
Just acknowledgement. But her eyes, just for a fraction of a second, shifted past him, toward the far corner of the room, a table most people had ignored all night.
Jim Lily. Quiet.
Someone was sitting there, watching. Then she looked back. Still composed. Still calm. Would you like me to take care of anything else while we fix this? Ethan smirked faintly, tapping his fingers once against the table, the subtle rhythm of someone used to being obeyed without question.
No.
Just try not to make the same mistake twice. The words landed lighter than before, but heavier somehow, because now the room was listening. Not openly, not obviously, but listening. Clara inclined her head slightly and turned, her steps measured, controlled, blending back into the quiet choreography of service. Behind her, the conversation resumed. Laughter returned. Glasses touched again. But something had shifted. Not in volume. Not in motion. In weight. In awareness. And from the corner of the room, unseen by most, a pair of eyes remained fixed, not on Ethan Caldwell, but on Clara Whitmore. The kitchen doors swung closed behind Clara with a soft thud, muting the polished laughter outside into a distant hum that felt almost unreal. Inside, the air was warmer, heavier, filled with the scent of butter, garlic, and something quietly urgent. Orders were being called, plates moving in precise rhythm. But Clara moved through it all without rushing, her pace steady, her breathing even, as if nothing unusual had just happened. She placed the plate down on the counter, her fingers lingering for half a second before letting go, not from hesitation, but from thought. "Refire on table 12, she said, her voice calm, controlled.
No explanation. No plan.
The chef glanced at her, ready to react, but something in her tone stopped him from asking questions. He nodded and turned back to the grill. Clara stepped aside, reaching for a clean cloth, wiping her hands slowly, methodically, as if resetting something invisible. Then, almost without thinking, her gaze shifted again.
Not to the dining room this time.
to the small service window that reflected just enough of the outside to see shapes, movement, fragments of faces. And there it was again. That table. That stillness. The figure in the corner had not moved. Not once. Not when the laughter rose. Not when Ethan spoke. Not even when the tension settled like dust over the room. Just watching. Clara's eyes softened. Not with fear, not with relief, but with recognition. She turned away before anyone could notice, picking up a fresh plate as the new order was placed in front of her. Perfectly cooked. Precise. She inspected it once. A quick, trained glance, then lifted it with quiet confidence. The doors opened again, and the noise returned. Softer now. More controlled. As if the room itself was aware that something had shifted, even if no one could name it yet. Clara walked back to table 12, her steps measured, her posture unchanged. Ethan was mid-sentence, explaining something about market positioning, his voice smooth, practiced, drawing quiet nods from the people around him. He did not notice her approach at first. He rarely did. "Your steak, sir," Clara said, placing the plate down with careful precision. Not too close. Not too far. Exactly where it should be. Ethan glanced down briefly, then back at his audience, continuing his point without interruption. But one of the investors leaned forward slightly, cutting in just enough to shift the attention. "Actually, Ethan, about the valuation model you mentioned earlier." The sentence trailed, not from uncertainty, but from curiosity. Clara remained still for a moment longer than necessary, not enough to be noticed as defiance, just enough to observe. Ethan's hand paused above his glass. Just slightly. Then continued. "It is straightforward," he replied, his tone confident, unshaken. "We adjusted the projections based on projected international growth." Clara's eyes flicked once to the open folder beside him. Numbers. Columns. A small detail, misaligned. Not obvious. Not to most. She stepped back, ready to leave, but then, just for a fraction of a second, she stopped. Not turning. Not speaking. Just noticing. And from across the room, in that quiet corner, the figure leaned forward for the first time. "There is a discrepancy," Clara said quietly, and the sentence did not rise above the level of the table, but it carried farther than anything spoken that evening. Ethan stopped. Not dramatically. Not visibly to most. Just a slight pause in the rhythm of his breathing, the smallest interruption in the confidence that usually flowed without resistance. The investor who had been speaking turned his head, curiosity sharpening his expression. "I am sorry," he asked, not to Ethan, but to Clara. She had not moved closer. She had not raised her voice. She simply stood where she was, one step behind. The table, hands loosely folded, posture composed. "The international growth adjustment," she continued, her tone even, almost gentle. "It appears to be calculated using last quarter's exchange rate, not the current one." Silence did not fall all at once. It unfolded, slowly, like something settling into place. Ethan's fingers tightened around the stem of his glass. Not enough to be seen as tension. Just enough to stop movement. He looked at her now. Fully.
For the first time.
Not as a server. Not as background. As a variable. "That would not materially affect the outcome," he said, his voice smooth, controlled, but there was a fraction less certainty in it now, something almost imperceptible. Clara nodded once, acknowledging the point without agreeing to it. "It shifts the projected return by approximately 3.8%, she said.
No hesitation.
No searching for the number, which places it below the threshold stated in your earlier summary. The investor leaned back slightly, eyes narrowing, not in suspicion of her, but in recalculation. Another man reached for the folder, flipping a page, scanning quickly, then more slowly. "She is right," he said, not loudly, but clearly enough for everyone to hear. The words did not echo. They did not need to. They landed. Ethan's expression did not change. That was the remarkable thing. Years of control, of negotiation, of never losing ground in a room like this, held his features perfectly still. But something behind his eyes shifted. A recalibration. A recognition. Clara did not watch him. She did not wait for acknowledgement. Her gaze moved, just for a second, toward the corner again. The figure there had straightened, attention no longer passive, but engaged. Then Clara stepped back, not retreating, simply returning to where she belonged in the structure of the room. "Your steak, sir," she added softly, as if that had been the only purpose of her presence. Ethan looked down at the plate, then back at the folder, then finally at her again. This time, there was no dismissal in his gaze. Only assessment. And something else. Something unfamiliar. The kind of uncertainty that does not come from ignorance, but from being seen. Around the table, the conversation had shifted. No longer centered on him. Now orbiting the numbers. The detail. The correction. Clara turned away before the moment could stretch further, her steps quiet, measured, disappearing once again into the rhythm of the room. But the balance had changed. Not loudly. Not completely. Just enough. And from the corner, unseen by most, a faint smile appeared, subtle and knowing, as if something long anticipated had finally begun. The room did not return to what it was before. It could not. Conversations resumed, but they moved differently now, more careful, more precise, as if every word had to pass an invisible test before being spoken. Ethan adjusted his posture, subtle, controlled, reclaiming space without appearing to do so. "As I was saying," he continued, his tone steady, refined, but there was a slight shift beneath it, a layer of calculation that had not been there before. He reached for the folder, turning a page with deliberate ease, as though the interruption had been nothing more than a minor correction, a detail already accounted for. "The revised projection accounts for short-term fluctuations," he added, redirecting the conversation with practiced authority. A few nods followed. Not as immediate as before. Not as automatic. One of the investors leaned forward again, tapping lightly on the page. "Would you mind walking us through that adjustment in more detail?" The question was polite, professional, but it carried weight. Ethan smiled faintly, the kind of smile that had closed deals worth millions, the kind that reassured without revealing anything. "Of course," he said, but as he spoke, his eyes flicked, just once, toward the direction Clara had gone. Not long. Just enough to confirm something. Or question it. Across the room, Clara moved between tables with the same quiet efficiency, refilling water, clearing plates, responding to requests with soft, measured responses. Nothing about her behavior suggested she had altered the trajectory of a high-stakes conversation just moments ago. She did not look back. She did not seek acknowledgement. She simply continued. And yet, something about her presence lingered. Not visible, not obvious, but present, like a note that had been struck and was still resonating long after the sound had faded. In the corner, the figure shifted again, setting down a glass untouched for the past 20 minutes. A hand, elegant, steady, rested briefly on the table before lifting a phone. Not to call, not to check messages, but to observe more closely, as if capturing something without needing a lens. Back at the main table, Ethan's explanation continued, fluid, articulate, rebuilding confidence piece by piece. Numbers flowed. Logic aligned. Control re-established. Or so it seemed. But every so often, there was a pause. A fraction too long. A recalculation that did not exist before. "And that brings us to the long-term outlook," he concluded, placing the folder down with quiet finality. Silence followed. Not empty. Evaluating. One of the investors leaned back, folding his hands. "Impressive," he said slowly. Then, after a beat, "Though I am curious," his gaze shifted, not to Ethan, but toward the space Clara had occupied minutes earlier. "Where did you find her?" The question landed differently than the others. It did not belong to the structure of the meeting. It stepped outside of it. Ethan did not answer immediately. For the first time that evening, he did not have a prepared response. His eyes followed the line of sight across the room, landing on Clara just as she set down a glass at another table, her movements calm, unhurried, unaware, or perhaps fully aware of the attention returning to her. Ethan exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly. "She is just a waitress," he said finally. The words sounded correct.
Familiar.
But something about them no longer fit as cleanly as they had before, because now the room had seen what he had not. And in the corner, the figure smiled again, this time with certainty, as if the moment they had been waiting for was no longer approaching, but already unfolding. The words lingered longer than they should have. Not loud, not dramatic.
Just out of place now.
She is just a waitress. The sentence settled across the table, but it did not land the way Ethan intended. Not anymore. One of the investors tilted his head slightly, studying him, then shifting his gaze back across the room. Clara was moving again, placing a fresh glass of water down with the same quiet precision, her posture unchanged, her expression neutral. But now people were watching differently.
Not openly.
Not obviously. Just enough. Interesting, the investor murmured, almost to himself, before closing the folder in front of him with a soft, deliberate motion. The meeting did not end, but it loosened. The structure softened. Questions became less formal, more probing. Not just about numbers, but about judgment. About awareness. Ethan responded as he always did, controlled, articulate, measured. But each answer seemed to arrive half a second later than it would have before, as if something unseen had inserted a delay between thought and speech. Across the room, Clara paused briefly at the service station, picking up a tray, adjusting a napkin that did not need adjusting. Her hands were steady now. Completely steady. She did not look toward the table. Not once. And yet she knew. She could feel it. The shift in weight. The way attention moves when something has been revealed but not fully understood. In the corner, the figure finally moved. A chair slid back softly, almost silent against the polished floor. No one noticed at first. Not the diners. Not the staff. Only Clara, for a fraction of a second, as she turned with the tray in her hands. Their eyes did not meet. They did not need to. The presence alone was enough. Back at the main table, Ethan reached for his glass, taking a slow sip, buying time without appearing to do so. "Shall we proceed to the final terms?" he asked, his voice steady, reclaiming control through structure, through momentum. But before anyone could answer, a voice entered the space.
Calm. Clear.
Unhurried. Perhaps we should pause for a moment. It did not come from the table. It came from behind them. The room did not freeze. It shifted.
Subtly.
Chairs angled. Conversations lowered. Attention redirected. The figure from the corner stepped into the light, her presence quiet but undeniable, the kind that does not demand attention because it already owns it. Margaret Whitmore. The name did not need to be spoken aloud for recognition to ripple through the room. It moved through posture, through eye contact, through the way people adjusted without thinking. Ethan turned.
Slowly.
Not startled. Not outwardly. But there it was again, that fraction of a second where control hesitated. Margaret's gaze passed over him briefly, not dismissive, not impressed, simply measuring. Then it moved beyond him, toward Clara. Clara had already set the tray down, already stepped back, already returned to stillness. Margaret's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile.
Not warm.
Not cold.
Certain.
Then she looked back at Ethan. "You were saying," she prompted gently. The room waited.
Not for Ethan this time.
For what he would do next. For a moment, no one spoke. Not because they did not know what to say, but because the room itself had shifted into something quieter, something more precise, where every word now carried consequence. Ethan held Margaret Whitmore's gaze just long enough to acknowledge her presence, then just short enough to avoid conceding anything. It was a delicate balance, one he had mastered over years of negotiation. But this was different, because this was not a negotiation. Not yet. "We were discussing the final terms of the partnership," Ethan said, his voice steady, controlled, carefully measured to match the weight of the moment. Margaret nodded slightly, as if accepting the answer, though her attention did not fully settle on him. It moved. Slowly. Deliberately. Back to Clara. Clara stood still beside the service station, hands lightly resting against the edge, posture straight, expression calm. She did not step forward. She did not step away. She simply remained. Present. Margaret took a few steps closer, not toward the table, but toward Clara, her heels making almost no sound against the floor. The distance between them closed quietly, without announcement, without urgency. "You notice the exchange rate," Margaret said, her voice soft, but clear enough to carry. It was not a question. Clara inclined her head slightly. "Yes, ma'am."
No hesitation.
No performance. Just truth. Margaret studied her for a moment, not as one studies a stranger, but as one confirms something already known. "Most people would not have," she said. Clara did not respond. She did not need to. The silence between them was not empty. It was understanding. Behind them, the table watched. Not as participants anymore, but as witnesses. Ethan's hand rested against the back of his chair, fingers still, his expression composed, but his attention fixed. He was no longer controlling the room.
He was part of it.
Margaret turned slightly, just enough to bring Ethan back into her field of view. "Details matter," she said, her tone unchanged. "Especially the ones people assume no one else will notice." Ethan nodded once, a controlled acknowledgement, but there was something different in the way he held himself now. Less absolute, more aware. Margaret's gaze lingered for a fraction longer, then shifted again, returning to Clara. "How long have you been working here?" she asked. "Just over a year," Clara replied. "And before that?" A brief pause. "Not from uncertainty."
From choice.
"Finance," Clara said simply. The word landed softly, but it changed everything. Around the table, shoulders straightened, eyes sharpened. Context began to rearrange itself. Ethan's expression did not break, but the calculation behind it intensified. Margaret's lips curved again, that same faint, knowing smile. "I thought so," she said. Then, after a beat, she added, "You left." Clara met her gaze, steady, calm. "I stepped away." Margaret nodded, as if the distinction mattered, because it did. She turned back toward the table, her presence shifting the center of gravity without force. "I believe we should continue this conversation," she said, her voice still gentle, but now carrying direction. "With all variables considered." No one questioned what that meant. No one needed clarification. Ethan exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, then straightened, adjusting his jacket with a small, precise movement. "Of course," he said, but this time when he spoke it was not to lead. It was to respond. And across the room, Clara picked up her tray again, stepping back into motion, her presence quiet once more. Yet nothing about her was invisible anymore. The table did not reclaim its former shape. It reformed around something new, something quieter, something that could not be ignored anymore. Margaret Whitmore took a seat without asking, her presence alone enough to rearrange the hierarchy that had existed just minutes before. No one objected. No one questioned. Chairs shifted slightly to make space, not out of politeness, but instinct. Ethan remained standing for a fraction longer than necessary, then sat, adjusting his cuff with precise control, as if reclaiming a version of himself that had just been challenged. "Shall we revisit the projections?" Margaret said, her tone calm, almost conversational, yet carrying an authority that required no emphasis. It was not a suggestion. It was direction. Ethan nodded once, opening the folder again, but this time his movements were slower, more deliberate, as though each page held more weight than before. "As mentioned, the long-term growth remains strong," he began, his voice steady, but there was a difference now. He was not speaking over the room. He was speaking into it, listening as much as presenting. One of the investors leaned forward again, tapping lightly on the adjusted figures. "Assuming the corrected exchange rate holds," he added, glancing briefly toward where Clara had been standing moments ago. The acknowledgement was subtle, but it did not go unnoticed. Ethan followed the glance this time, not resisting it, not dismissing it. His eyes found Clara across the room. She was pouring water for another table, her posture unchanged, her expression neutral, as if none of this belonged to her. But it did. Everyone knew it now. Even him. He looked back at the table. "Yes," he said, with the corrected rate. No defense.
No deflection.
just alignment. The conversation moved forward again, but it no longer revolved around dominance. It revolved around accuracy, around awareness, around trust. Margaret listened without interruption, her gaze steady, her expression unreadable, absorbing every detail, every tone, every pause between words. Then, after a moment, she spoke. "Numbers can be corrected," she said softly. "That is the easy part." The room stilled again, not out of tension, but anticipation. She continued, her voice even measured. "What is more difficult to correct is how those numbers are handled when no one is expected to notice." Ethan held her gaze, not looking away this time. Not because he was unchallenged, but because he understood the weight of what she was saying. This was no longer about projections. It was about judgment, about character. "You are right," he said finally. The words came without hesitation, but not without cost. Across the room, Clara set down the water pitcher, her movements still precise, still quiet, but slower now, as if the moment had reached her too. She did not turn. She did not react. She simply stood for a brief second longer than necessary, then moved again, continuing her work as if nothing had changed. But everything had. Margaret's gaze followed her once more, then returned to Ethan. "I prefer to invest in people who understand that difference before they are reminded of it," she said. Not harsh, not accusing, just clear. The kind of clarity that does not raise its voice because it does not need to. Ethan exhaled slowly, his posture shifting almost imperceptibly, not in defeat, but in recognition. The room watched, not waiting for a reaction, but witnessing a change. And for the first time that evening, the most powerful man at the table was no longer trying to control the outcome. He was trying to deserve it. The room no longer felt like a stage for a performance. It felt like a place where something real had been revealed, and no one could pretend they had not seen it. The conversation continued, but it had changed its tone entirely. No longer polished for impression. Now sharpened for truth. Ethan closed the folder slowly, his fingers resting on the cover for a brief moment before pulling his hand back, as if acknowledging that control was no longer something he could simply place on the table and expect others to accept. "I appreciate the correction," he said, his voice steady but softer now, directed not at the group, but toward the space where Clara had been. It was not an apology. Not yet. But it was the first step toward one. Margaret watched him closely, not interrupting, not guiding, simply observing the shift with quiet certainty. "Then perhaps we should consider what happens next," she said, her tone unchanged, but the weight behind it unmistakable. One of the investors leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "The numbers can be adjusted," he repeated, almost as if testing the statement against the moment. "But trust," he did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Ethan nodded once, slowly this time, not as a gesture of agreement, but of understanding. He turned his head again, his eyes finding Clara across the room. She was at the far end now, clearing a table, stacking plates with the same measured care, her movements untouched by the shift that had redefined the entire room. Or so it seemed, because when she set the last plate down, her hand paused for just a fraction of a second. Not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough. Ethan stood. The motion was quiet, controlled, but it drew attention anyway. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was unexpected. He adjusted his jacket once, then stepped away from the table, leaving the conversation behind without dismissing it. Margaret did not stop him. She simply watched. The room followed him with their eyes, not openly, not obviously, but in that subtle way attention moves when something important is about to happen. Ethan crossed the distance between tables slowly, not rushing, not hesitating, each step measured, deliberate. When he reached Clara, he did not speak immediately. For a moment, he simply stood there, watching her finish placing the last glass down. She turned then, meeting his gaze fully for the first time, without the barrier of roles, without the structure of service between them. Silence. Not uncomfortable, not tense, just honest. Ethan exhaled softly. "You were right," he said. The words were simple, unembellished, but they carried more weight than anything he had said all evening. Clara held his gaze, her expression unchanged, calm, composed, as if she had not been waiting for those words at all. It was a detail, she replied quietly.
No pride. No querexchen.
Just truth. Ethan nodded once, absorbing that, understanding something deeper beneath it. It was not just a detail, he said. Another pause. Then, more carefully, I should not have spoken to you the way I did. The apology came without defense, without qualification. Clara studied him for a moment, not judging, not forgiving, simply seeing. Then she gave a small nod. Not acceptance. Not rejection. Just acknowledgement. Behind them, the room remained still, watching without watching, listening without listening. Margaret's gaze rested on the two of them, her expression unchanged, but there was something in it now. Not surprise. Not approval. Recognition. Because the moment she had been waiting for was not the correction of numbers. It was this. The point where power chose to become aware of itself. And for the first time that evening, the silence in the room did not feel heavy. It felt clear. The moment did not end with applause. It ended with stillness. The kind that settles into a room when something important has already happened, and everyone knows it without needing to say a word. Clara gave a small nod, then turned back to her work, picking up the tray as if nothing had changed, as if the entire evening had not shifted around a single quiet correction and a single quiet apology. She moved away with the same calm rhythm, disappearing back into the flow of service, her presence no longer invisible, but no longer needing to be seen. Ethan remained where he stood for a second longer, watching her go, not with curiosity this time, not with calculation, but with something quieter. Respect. Then he turned back toward the table. The walk back felt different. Not longer. Just more deliberate. When he reached his seat, he did not rush to sit. He paused, glancing briefly at Margaret, who met his gaze with that same steady, knowing expression. No approval.
No judgment.
Just acknowledgement. He took a seat. The room waited, but not in the same way as before. This time, it was not waiting for him to impress. It was waiting for him to continue as he was now. Let us proceed, Ethan said, his voice even, but stripped of the sharp edge it once carried. The conversation resumed, but it no longer revolved around dominance or persuasion. It moved through clarity, through precision, through a shared understanding that had not been there before. Questions came, and he answered them, not defensively, not performatively, just accurately. And when uncertainty appeared, he did not cover it. He acknowledged it, adjusted,
continued.
Margaret listened in silence, her attention unwavering, measuring not just the numbers now, but the man presenting them. Time passed quietly. Minutes that felt longer than they were, not because they dragged, but because they mattered. Finally, Margaret closed the folder in front of her with a soft, final motion. The sound was small, but it carried. We will move forward, she said.
No hesitation.
No condition attached. Just a decision. A breath moved through the table, subtle, controlled but present. One of the investors leaned back, a faint smile appearing, while another nodded slowly, as if confirming something beyond the deal itself. Ethan did not react immediately. He held the moment, just for a second, then inclined his head slightly.
Thank you, he said.
Simple.
Direct. No excess.
Margaret rose from her seat, smoothing her sleeve with a small, precise motion. Her gaze shifted once more across the room, finding Clara again, now speaking softly to another guest, her expression calm, her posture unchanged. Margaret's lips curved into the faintest smile. Then she turned and began to leave, her presence moving through the room without disruption, yet leaving a quiet awareness in its wake. The meeting dissolved gradually, conversations lowering, chairs shifting, the structure of the evening returning, but never fully the same. Ethan remained seated for a moment longer, his hand resting lightly on the table, his thoughts no longer racing ahead, but settling into something clearer. Then he stood, adjusting his jacket once more, and glanced across the room. Clara did not look back this time. She did not need to, because the lesson had already been seen. Not in what was said, not in what was corrected, but in what had changed. And as the lights continued to glow softly against polished glass and quiet conversation, one truth lingered in the space long after everyone returned to their roles. She did not raise her voice. She raised the standard.